Here's a rewritten version of your story while keeping it within 4,800 characters. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Clint Eastwood stepped inside. His presence alone carried a weight that made people sit up straighter. He wasn't here as an actor today. This was real, and the stakes were high. A high-profile lawsuit had forced him into the legal arena, and Judge Harold Whitaker, known for his sharp tongue and even sharper wit, wasn't about to take it easy on him. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Whitaker said, adjusting his glasses as he leaned back in his chair. "Not often we get a Hollywood legend in here. I hope you realize that courtroom theatrics won't sway my decision." A few snickers rippled through the audience. The opposing lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man who reeked of overconfidence, smirked as he arranged his papers. Clint, unfazed, gave a slow, deliberate nod. The lawyer wasted no time launching into his argument. "Your Honor, my client entered into a business agreement with Mr. Eastwood in good faith. He upheld his part, but Mr. Eastwood failed to deliver, causing significant financial damage." He paced dramatically. "The evidence is all here: documents, emails, and signed agreements." Judge Whitaker sighed dramatically, his amusement thinly veiled. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have an attorney, or are you planning to squint your way out of this?" More laughter. Even the court clerk cracked a smile. Clint stood slowly, straightening his jacket with the same measured confidence that made him a screen icon. Then in his deep, gravelly voice he said, "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." The laughter died. Even the opposing lawyer raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. The judge, intrigued, motioned for him to proceed. "Well, this ought to be interesting." Clint walked to the table where the documents lay. He picked one up, flipping through it with the same precision he handled a script. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims I breached a contract, so let's take a good look at this contract." He held up a specific page. Page 3, Clause 7 states that for the agreement to be legally binding, all parties must sign in ink. No digital signatures, no stamps, ink. He handed a copy to the judge. If you look closely at the plaintiff's version, their signature is electronic. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Whitaker narrowed his eyes as he examined the document. His smug expression faded. He glanced at the opposing lawyer. "Is this accurate?" the lawyer stammered, flipping through his own copies. "Well, technically the agreement was acknowledged electronically." "Not technically," Clint interrupted, his voice steady. "Legally." Silence. The judge took a deep breath and set the paper down. "I must say, Mr. Eastwood, that's quite the catch." Clint simply nodded. "Your Honor, I just read the fine print." The case collapsed instantly. Without a valid contract, the claims against him held no weight. Judge Whitaker, humbled, looked at Eastwood with newfound respect. "I underestimated you, Mr. Eastwood," the judge admitted. Clint turned toward the exit, pausing for just a moment. He glanced back, his expression unreadable. "A lot of people do." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a courtroom full of stunned faces. As Clint walked out of the courtroom, the hushed silence lingered for a moment before erupting into murmurs. Reporters, sensing the drama of the moment, scrambled to their feet, eager to catch him before he disappeared into the outside world. The opposing lawyer, still flustered, gathered his papers with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, while Judge Whitaker sat back in his chair, rubbing his temple as if replaying the scene in his mind. Outside, the midday sun cast long shadows as Clint stepped onto the courthouse steps. A swarm of journalists and photographers surged forward, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. "Mr. Eastwood, how did you know about the loophole?" one reporter shouted. "Were you always planning to represent yourself?" another asked. Clint stopped at the top of the stairs, hands in his pockets, surveying the crowd. He wasn't a man who needed to say much to be heard. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't pick fights," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I sure know how to finish them." The cameras flashed wildly, the journalists hanging on to every word. A reporter pressed forward. "Does this mean you'll be taking on more legal battles in the future?" Clint gave the hint of a smirk. "I prefer to stick to directing, but..." If someone wants to drag me into court, they'd better read their own contracts first. The crowd chuckled, and even a few of the security officers standing nearby smiled. With that, Clint descended the steps, moving with the same effortless confidence that had made him a legend. As he reached the parking lot, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Eastwood." He turned to see Judge Whitaker himself, having stepped outside to watch the scene unfold. There was no smugness left on the judge's face, only curiosity. He approached, lowering his voice as he reached Clint's side. "I have to admit," Whitaker said, shaking his head, "I thought you were just another celebrity who'd get chewed up by the legal system." Clint shrugged. "I don't like to talk unless I've got something worth saying." The judge chuckled. "You're a dangerous man to underestimate." Clint gave a small nod. "So I've heard." With that, he slid into his waiting car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving behind a courthouse that wouldn't forget this day anytime soon. As Clint's car disappeared down the street, the buzz outside the courthouse didn't die down. Reporters continued discussing the shocking turn of events, and social media was already ablaze with headlines. Clint Eastwood schools a judge in his own courtroom, and the good, the bad, and the legally outmatched. Inside, Judge Whitaker lingered near the steps, watching the last of the reporters disperse. He let out a deep breath, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered to himself, rubbing his chin. He had presided over countless cases, but this one would stick with him. Meanwhile, Clint drove through the city streets, his hands relaxed on the wheel. He wasn't one to gloat, but the satisfaction of exposing a weak case and the arrogance that came with it was undeniable. He had seen this kind of thing too many times in Hollywood, people underestimating him, assuming he was just another movie star with no real-world sense. Today had been a reminder that he wasn't just a man of words, he was a man who did his homework. His phone buzzed. A call from an old friend. He tapped his earpiece. "Yeah?" "Clint," the voice said, with a chuckle. "I saw what you did today, that was something." Clint smirked. "Just another day, partner. You ever think about law school? I hear they could use a few good men like you." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll stick to directing. Less paperwork." The voice on the other end laughed. "Fair enough. Just don't be surprised if some lawyer tries to hire you as a consultant after this." Clint's smirk lingered as he pulled up to his ranch, the sprawling land, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Stepping out of the car, he took a deep breath of the crisp evening air. This was his real world. The courtroom had been a battle, but here, out in the open, where life was simpler and the rules were clear, this was where he truly belonged. He tipped his hat slightly, glanced back at the horizon, and muttered to himself, "Ain't much for courtrooms, but that sure was fun." Then, with the same quiet confidence he had carried his whole life, Clint walked into his house, leaving behind a legal showdown that people would be talking about for years. As Clint stepped inside his ranch house, the familiar creak of the wooden floor welcomed him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, settling into his favorite chair by the fireplace. The warmth of the flames flickered against the walls, casting long shadows as he leaned back, letting the day's events sink in. The courtroom battle had been unexpected, but it had reminded him of something. How often people judged others based on perception rather than reality. They saw him as a Hollywood cowboy, a relic of old-school filmmaking, not realizing he was as sharp off-screen as he was on it. His phone buzzed again. Another call. He sighed, debating whether to answer, but curiosity won. "Yeah?" "Clint, it's Mike," came the familiar voice of an old producer friend. "Saw what happened in court today. You really shook things up." Clint exhaled, sipping his drink. "Didn't do much, just read the fine print." Mike chuckled. "Well, the world's talking about it. You know how the internet is, they're calling it Dirty Harry's Revenge." Clint smirked, but didn't respond. He didn't care much for online chatter. "Listen," Mike continued, his tone shifting. "I've got an offer for you. A courtroom drama. Studio's been looking for something sharp, something different. You ever think about playing a lawyer?" Clint shook his head, staring into the fire. "I play men who don't talk much. Lawyers talk too damn much. Mike laughed. Fair point. Still, think about it. Could be a hell of a story. Clint didn't answer right away. His mind drifted back to the way the judge had looked at him when the case fell apart. The way the opposing lawyer had scrambled, the murmurs in the courtroom, the respect that had been earned in an instant. Maybe there was something there. Not a movie, but a lesson. A reminder that knowledge was power, and even the most confident men could fall if they didn't do their homework. Finally, he said, "I'll think about it." Mike sighed. "That's all I ask. And Clint, don't go pulling any more surprises on the legal world." "You're scaring the lawyers," Clint chuckled. "Maybe they ought to be scared." He ended the call, set his phone down, and took another slow sip of whiskey. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind rolled through the open land, vast and quiet just the way he liked it. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't looking for another fight, but if another one came his way, well, he'd be ready. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who played by the rules, he was a man who knew them, and that made all the difference. The night settled in over Clint's ranch, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. He sat there for a while, watching the fire dance, his mind drifting. The court battle had been amusing, sure, but there was something else nagging at him, something deeper. Maybe it wasn't about proving a point. Maybe it was about the way people underestimated experience, assuming a man had nothing left to offer just because he wasn't playing the game the way they expected. The judge, the lawyer, even the spectators, they had all made the same mistake, and in Clint's world, mistakes had consequences. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He set his glass down, rising to his feet. Late-night visitors weren't common out here. He opened the door to find a tall man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Eastwood," the man said, offering a tight smile. "Apologies for the late hour. My name is Richard Kane, I'm an attorney." Clint raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "I already won my case, counselor. You're late to the party." Kane chuckled. "I'm not here about that case." He hesitated, then continued, "I represent some very high-profile clients who were impressed by what you did in court today. They believe a man like you could be useful in certain situations." Clint exhaled slowly. "What kind of situations?" The lawyer glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Let's just say not every legal battle is fought in a courtroom. Sometimes people need someone who understands the law, but also knows how to operate outside of it. Someone with your instincts." Clint studied the man for a moment, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. He had been around long enough to recognize when someone was hiding their real intentions. "Let me stop you right there," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "If you're looking for a hired gun, you knocked on the wrong door," Kane smirked. "I figured you'd say that, but think about it. The legal world is a battlefield too, and there aren't many warriors who understand both sides of the fight." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "I don't fight battles that aren't mine." The lawyer nodded as if he expected the answer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, setting it on the wooden railing. "If you change your mind, give me a call." Clint didn't move. He simply watched as the man turned and walked back to his sleek black car, disappearing into the night. He looked down at the card but didn't pick it up. Instead, he let the wind carry it away, fluttering off into the darkness. Some fights were worth stepping into. This wasn't one of them. With a slow shake of his head, Clint stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. The fire was still burning, steady and strong. He poured himself one last drink, sat back down, and let the night take its course. Tomorrow was another day, and if trouble came knocking again, well, he'd handle it the way he always had. On his terms. As the night deepened, Clint sat back, in his chair, the weight of the day settling over him like a well-worn coat. He had seen his fair share of fights, both on-screen and off, but there was something about today's battle that stuck with him. Maybe it was how quickly people had dismissed him. Maybe it was how easily the powerful could be brought down by their own arrogance. Or maybe it was the realization that he wasn't done just yet. The next morning, the crisp air carried the scent of fresh earth as Clint stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel. The world had already moved on. News outlets were spinning their stories, the internet was having its fun, and the slick lawyer from court was probably drowning his sorrows in expensive bourbon. But out here, none of that mattered. He walked to his truck, the engine growling to life as he pulled onto the open road. He didn't have a destination in mind, just a feeling that there was something waiting for him on the horizon. His phone buzzed again, another call. He let it ring a few times before answering. "This is Eastwood." "Clint, it's Judge Whitaker." That was unexpected. Clint didn't say anything, just let the judge fill the silence. "I've been thinking about yesterday," Whitaker admitted. "You embarrassed me in my own courtroom." Clint smirked. "Didn't mean to." "Yeah, well, it was a damn good lesson." The judge sighed. "Listen, I don't normally do this, but I have a friend, a federal judge, who saw what happened. He thinks you might be able to help with something bigger." Clint frowned. "Not interested." "You haven't even heard what it is." "I don't need to." Whitaker chuckled. "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, just know this isn't some Hollywood drama. This is real." Clint exhaled, glancing out at the open road ahead. "Yeah, so am I." With that, he hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. He wasn't looking for a new fight. But if one found him, well, he'd be ready. As the sun climbed higher, he pressed down on the gas, letting the road stretch out before him. Whatever was waiting ahead, trouble, adventure, or just another quiet day, he'd meet it like he always had, on his own terms. Clint drove for miles, the hum of the engine his only companion. The open road had always been his sanctuary, a place where the world's noise faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. But this time, something lingered in the back of his mind. That damn judge, that damn offer. He didn't owe anybody anything. He wasn't some pawn to be moved around in a game he hadn't agreed to play. And yet the way Whitaker had framed it, something bigger, stuck with him. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving anything. Clint had spent his life cutting through nonsense, getting to the truth of things, whether in a script or in real life. And right now, something about this whole situation felt like a puzzle he hadn't quite solved yet. At a roadside diner, he pulled in for a cup of coffee. The place was quiet, just a handful of early risers scattered across the booths. Clint took his usual spot near the window, nodding to the waitress as she poured him a steaming mug. "Didn't expect to see you out this way, Mr. Eastwood," she said with a knowing smile. "You on your way somewhere or just passing through?" Clint took a slow sip, then shrugged. "Haven't decided yet," she chuckled. "Ain't that the best way to travel?" "Maybe." As he glanced outside, a familiar black sedan pulled into the lot. Clint exhaled, already knowing who it was before the man even stepped out. Richard Kane, the lawyer from the night before. Clint watched him approach, his stride too confident, like a man used to getting what he wanted. The bell above the door jingled as Kane entered, scanning the diner until his eyes locked onto Clint. With a smirk, he walked over, sliding into the booth across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Coffee?" Clint asked dryly, motioning to the waitress. Kane smirked. "I'm more of an espresso guy." "Figures." The lawyer leaned forward, folding his hands. "You didn't take my card last night, but I had a feeling we weren't done talking." Clint set his mug down, giving Kane an unimpressed look. "You got a bad habit of not taking a hint." Kane chuckled. "And you have a bad habit of walking away from things you might actually be interested in." Clint raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Kane sighed, then slid a manila folder across the table. "Humor me," he said. "Take a look." Clint didn't touch it. "You like the truth, don't you?" Kane pressed. "So do the people I represent. This isn't some petty lawsuit. This is about corruption, power, people who think they're untouchable." Clint finally picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were legal documents, photographs, financial statements, all pointing to something big, something deep. Skimmed the contents, his expression unreadable. Kane watched him closely. You exposed a legal loophole yesterday that saved you from a bad deal. Now imagine if you did that on a much larger scale, exposing men who are running the system from behind the curtain. Clint closed the folder and set it aside. And what do you want from me? Kane smiled. Your instincts. Your ability to see what others don't. We're not asking you to be a lawyer. We're asking you to be you. The diner felt quieter somehow, the weight of the conversation pressing down on it. Clint leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. He had spent decades cutting through the nonsense, exposing truth through stories. But this was a different kind of story. One that didn't end when the camera stopped rolling. He exhaled slowly. Maybe he wasn't done just yet. With a small smirk, he reached for his coffee and took another sip. Tell me more. Kane's smirk widened, sensing the shift in Clint's demeanor. He leaned in, lowering his voice. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this table. Clint took another sip of coffee, unfazed. I'm not much of a gossip. Kane glanced around the diner, making sure no one was paying attention. There's a network of high-profile figures, politicians, corporate heads, judges who operate above the law. They bend the system, cover their tracks, and make sure no one ever digs too deep. But every system has weak points, and after what you did in court, my employers think you might be able to help us find them. Clint looked unimpressed. You don't need me for that. You've got lawyers, investigators, people who actually do this for a living. Kane smirked. Yeah, and most of them have a price. They get scared, they back off, they make deals. But you? You're different, you don't flinch. Clint set his mug down, folding his arms. And what happens when I find something you don't like? Kane's expression turned serious. Then we deal with it. Legally. Clint chuckled, shaking his head. Now see, that's where you lost me. You want me to believe that guys, like you play by the rules? Kane sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I get it. You don't trust me. But I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust your instincts. You've seen men like this before, haven't you? The ones who think they're untouchable. Clint's jaw tightened. He had seen them. In Hollywood, in business, in every corner of the world where power played by its own set of rules. He picked up the folder again, flipping through it more carefully this time. Photos of men in suits shaking hands behind closed doors. Memos with redacted lines. Financial transactions that didn't add up. Something about it felt real. Kane watched him closely. You don't have to say yes right now, but if you do, know this, you won't be playing a role. This isn't a movie, these people will fight back. Clint closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Yeah, he said, finishing his coffee. But so will I. Kane grinned. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Clint stood up, throwing a few bills on the table. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but one thing was clear. Someone out there thought they were too powerful to fall. And if there was one thing Clint Eastwood had spent his life proving, it was that no one was untouchable. He tipped his hat to the waitress, gave Kane one last glance, and walked out of the diner. The game had just begun.